Today in Edge of Eternities, we get some of the best and most expensive reprints from the entire set, including a couple cards that we're definitely going to be teaching Arena Zoomers about, a mythic that just might be the red Doppelgang, and so much more. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Edge of Eternities spoilers. So we're working our way through week 2 of spoiler season, and we got a big one today. We got all the cards from the land sheet, we got all the special guests, and a bunch more stuff, which means we should probably jump right into it. Start talking sweet new Edge of Eternities cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can snag them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should head on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk Edge of Eternities. So first up today, we get an interesting new Orzhov legend in Sir Vondam Sunstar Exemplar. So a 2-mana Orzhov 2/2 legendary human knight. Vigilance and Menace. It says when another creature you control dies or is put into exile, put a +1/+1 counter on it and you gain a life. And then when it dies or is put into exile, while its power is 4 or greater, destroy up to 1 target non-land permanent. So Sir Vondam, we've seen similar 2-drops in the past that grow as your stuff dies. Unruly Mob, Judge Magister Gabarinth. But this is easily the best version of this effect. Not only does it have Vigilance and Menace, and it starts as a 2/2, and it grows when things go into exile, but if you can grow it a bit, once it dies, it's gonna kind of vindicate one of your opponent's things. I guess not true vindicate because you can't blow up lands, but still blowing up any non-land permanent is a pretty strong effect. So Sir Vondam, I think this card was designed to be played with the warp mechanic. The exile on this looks kind of weird, but I think the idea is you can play this in some sort of warp deck. You warp your Hayland or Timeline Color or Exalted Sunborn. When it goes to exile, you're going to get a counter and gain some life. And then eventually, when your Sir Vondam dies, you get to blow something up. So it seems like a pretty good piece for some sort of Orzhov warp style deck. But I'm even more excited about this card is a blink effect. One of the side effects of formatting this card to work with warp because it comes from Edge of Eternities also means it's going to work with blink stuff. So when you blink one of your own creatures, it's going to go to exile, which is going to grow your Sir Vondam, and then its last mode even works with a blink effect. It doesn't necessarily have to die. You could just grow it and then blink it and then blow up whatever you need to blow up. So we have a lot of cards that can do this in Standard. Charming Prince and Parting Gust and Unyielding Gatekeeper and Fortune Loyal Steed. So I'm excited to see if we make some sort of blink deck around this card. It also seems absurd with Ketramos. I think we can see the pieces for some sort of Ketramos exile blink style deck showing up in Standard. Now you get Sir Vondam into Ketramos. Cosmogoyf also works really well to plan because you're putting stuff into exile, and then you can play the blink stuff like Charming Prince, maybe throw in some warp stuff. So I feel like maybe we get a pretty sweet Orzhov self-exile / blink deck out of this card. It's also interesting if you can just grow its power in other ways. So yes, it grows as your stuff dies or goes to exile, but if you can just stack up a couple of anthems like a Lumen-Class Frigate, which we'll talk about more in a minute, or a War Leader's Call, you can get Sir Vondam's power up so it's always 4, which means whenever you blink it, whenever it dies, you get to blow something up, which is probably, more of a janky fun plan than a competitive plan since the anthems don't really see that much play in Standard, but it is a fun way to take advantage of this card. Another way you can get its power up to 4 to turn on the removal mode. Also notable that it's a knight, and my history of judging knight decks in Standard, not that great. You probably remember Circle of Loyalty and me being very hyped for knights way back in Eldorade, and then they flop super hard, but you can see a lot of pieces for a knight's deck. We got a bunch of good knights from Final Fantasy and Cecil and Dion and Squall. Sir Vondam, another knight, so who knows? With cards being legal in Standard for 3 years now, it is definitely possible at some point in the next 3 years, we get enough good knights to actually build a at least semi-competitive knight deck, which Sir Vondam would probably be a part of. Once you get back to older formats, I'm actually interested in this card in Modern in some numbers. You remember Ketramos kind of came out back in Aetherdrift, the one good card from Aetherdrift, and it kind of created a new Modern archetype, or really powered up the black-white blink archetype in Modern, which is still a very legit tier archetype, and I think that Sir Vondam actually fits in that archetype really well. The whole idea is you're blinking your stuff with Phalian, Flicker Wisp, and drawing cards with Ketramos. Sir Vondam just fits really well in that plan. It's your blinking your stuff, it's growing, eventually it's blowing up stuff when you flicker it. So I don't think it'll be a 4 of since it's legendary, but I could certainly see some numbers showing up in the Modern Ketramos deck. Once you get back to older formats, especially in Commander, there's some pretty easy ways to just turn this into a 4-power creature all the time. Flowering of the White Tree, for example, probably the best. Just for 2 mana, it gives all your legendary creatures +2/+1 in Ward, which means Sir Vondam is going to be a 4/3. So if you're building around Sir Vondam in Commander, I feel like this is the first card you add to your deck, because once you get down Flowering of the White Tree, every blink effect that you cast on Sir Vondam is just going to let you blow up the best non-land on the battlefield. You can also do it with like Day of Destinies. There's a few of these weird Legendary Matters Anthem effects. They give +2 power rather than +1 power. And then I think you just build Sir Vondam, similar to the other Orzhov Blink commanders, which there's not a ton of. Ketramos tends to be a Blink commander. Minthara, which I don't think I've ever actually played against, but is an Orzhov Blink commander. So you just overload on like Ephemerates and Restoration Angels, Eerie Interludes, Conjurer's Closet, blinking all your stuff, getting tons of value, maybe throwing a Panharmonicon, and Sir Vondam's going to be the perfect leader for that deck. So Sir Vondam, I think this card's actually very good. I think it can see standard play. It might even be able to see a bit of modern play, and it's a pretty cool Orzhov Blink commander. We also got another spacecraft, one that we mentioned briefly a moment ago, in Lumen-Class Frigate. So a 2-mana spacecraft. It has station, of course, so you can tap your creatures at sorcery speed to add charge counters. Once you get at least 2 charge counters, other creatures you control get +1/+1. And once you get 12 or more, it turns into a 3/5 flying lifelink. So Lumen-Class Frigate, it's essentially an anthem. It's nice that it's first station cost, or charge counter cost. I don't really call that ability exactly, but it's nice you only need 2 counters on it, which means you can tap any lowly Savannah Lions and turn this into essentially an Anthem of Champions on an artifact. Anthem of Champions hasn't really seen play in standard, although it is worth pointing out it's in green, and green hasn't been a good color, so that might be part of the reason why. And then if you ever get 12 or more counters on it, you kind of get an Ether Sphere Harvester. Not a busted card, but a 3/5 flying lifelinker isn't a bad card to have access to. So Lumen-Class Frigate, I have some concerns for this card. So it would fit well in some sort of like Boros Convoke style deck, right? With your Resolute Reinforcements and Imidane Recruiters, you go super wide, you tap one thing, all your stuff gets +1/+1. The problem I see with this card is I'm just not sure that it's better than the other cards that kind of do a similar thing. Like, War Leader's Call seems kind of busted, and that doesn't even really see you play in the Boros Convoke deck anymore. That gives +1/+1 for 3 mana, and you get direct damage as your creatures enter. The bigger deal is, Case of the Gateway Express essentially does what Lumen-Class Frigate does. It doesn't grow your toughness, only power, but it gives all your creatures +1/+0 once you solve it, which you can solve in 1 turn typically, and it's also a removal spell. So I think the upside of being a removal spell that turns into an anthem is just more than being an anthem that if you tap 12 or more power of creatures turns into a not massive but okay lifelinking flyer. So I think this probably just ends up being a worse version of other effects that we already have in the format. Plus, it's not like anthems are all that playable in 2025 anyway. You could play it in some sort of White Weenie style deck. That might be the best home, some sort of like Recruitment Officer, Voice of Victory, play all your cheap stuff, crew up your spacecraft. But even there, I kind of feel like Case of the Gateway Express might just be better. It is cool with Sir Vondam, like we talked about. If you are on the like stack up anthems to get its power up to 4, so every time you blink it, you blow something up plan, this does get the job done. So it could be something you play with Sir Vondam. But Lumen-Class Frigate, I think this card's just fine. Like, it's fine at what it does. It's like relatively easy to turn on. I'm just not sure that it actually is stronger than the other versions of the fact that we already have. So unless you really need your anthem to be an artifact or a spacecraft for some reason, I kind of feel like you just probably stick with Case of the Gateway Express or whatever. We also got a new black reanimation creature in Xu-Ifit, Osteoharmonist. So it's a 3-mana 2/3 legendary human wizard. It is tap, return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It's a skeleton in addition to its other types, and it has no abilities. Activate only as a sorcery. So Xu-Ifit starts out reading pretty strong. Like, a 3-drop that just taps to reanimate something from your graveyard actually seems pretty powerful. Although the fact that that thing loses all abilities is at best going to be an extra hoop to jump through to actually make this card good. And at worst, might be a deal breaker for this card. So if you want some comparisons, I kind of forgot, but we actually currently have Geth Thane of Contracts in Standard. Going to be rotating in a couple weeks, but Geth is a 3-drop that for 3 mana taps and reanimates something. The downside is it gives your thing -1/-1, and it really hasn't seen any play since it's been in Standard for like 3 years now. A better comparison might be Abyssal Harvester, and this is the card that kind of makes me skeptical of Xu-Ifit, because when Abyssal Harvester was previewed in Foundations, I thought it might be one of the better cards from that set, and so far it hasn't taken off. It's a 3-mana 3/2 non-legendary demon warlock that taps to exile a card from a graveyard that was put there this turn, and you get a token copy of it, but it's a nightmare, and then you lose your other nightmare, so you can only ever have one of the tokens on the battlefield. But Abyssal Harvester kind of does similar things to Xu-Ifit. Yes, there's a timing restriction that it only hits something that went in the graveyard this turn, but it's not legendary. It can hit your opponent's graveyard, and most importantly, your stuff still has abilities, and I think that's the biggest challenge with Xu-Ifit. If you think about our current Standard, in the stuff that people like to reanimate, it's stuff like Atraxa, Atali, Velgavoth, and these aren't cards that you're reanimating just because you want a 7/7 or a 9/9 on the battlefield. You're reanimating them because they have really strong enters abilities, or because Velgavoth has strong static abilities. If you reanimate something like this with Xu-Ifit, you kind of just get a vanilla creature out of it, which doesn't seem that great. So how could we actually make Xu-Ifit work? And I think the easiest answer is to play it in some sort of blank deck. So the idea here is you can use Xu-Ifit to like reanimate a Velgavoth. Sure, it's going to be a vanilla 9/9, but then if you use a Parting Gust or a Charming Prince or a Salvation Swan to blink the Velgavoth, when it comes back in, it's a real Velgavoth with all of its abilities. So I think that's the easiest way to take advantage of this. There's also some cards where making them lose all of their abilities might be an upside. Like if you tap this to reanimate a Death Shadow, you just get a 13/13 because you won't have its ability, which is actually a negative a lot of the time, making it smaller with -X, where X is your life total. So I don't know if this is actually like modern competitive, but it does sound like it can be kind of funny to build around, and that might be the way to go with this. The deck I want to build the most around Xu-Ifit is actually reanimating stuff with negative ETB triggers. So this is finally a card that can reanimate Phage the Untouchable. Sure, Phage isn't going to have any abilities, which is kind of annoying, but still you can reanimate a Phage, or like an Eternities, really massive. It's a 9/8 flying trampler, except when it enters, you got to skip your next 2 turns. But if you reanimate it with Xu-Ifit, you don't got to skip the turns because it got no ability. Same with Hunted Horror, a 2-mana 7/7 trample. But when it comes into play, your opponent gets 2 3/3s with protection from black. So these cards are pretty funny with Xu-Ifit, since it really takes advantage of the fact that they're reanimated as skeletons with no abilities, because you get rid of their downside, and then you can just play like Torp Orbs, Hushbringers, so then you can actually cast these cards from your hand as well. So that seems like a really fun, probably semi-competitive way to build around this card. As far as Commander is concerned, I'm not especially excited for this card. There's so much good reanimation in Commander. If you're trying to be super efficient and spiky, you got like Reanimate and Animate Dead, just reanimate something for 1 or 2 mana. And then if you're playing more casual Battlecruiser, you get cards like Breach the Multiverse that are a lot of mana, but reanimate a whole bunch of things. So I'm just not really sure what I do with Xu-Ifit. In Commander, I'm also just very skeptical of big vanilla creatures, and this kind of seems like it just turns all your stuff into big vanilla creatures. So if I was going to play this card in Commander, it's kind of the same as Standard. I'd be looking into Blink deck, something like Aminatu the Fate Shifter, Ketramos, where I can use this to reanimate, then I blink whatever I reanimate to turn it into a real creature. It's also probably cute in Skeletons, just because Skeletons really aren't very good, and we don't have that many good Skeletons. So this just turning something into a skeleton probably makes it one of the best skeleton cards, just because the competition isn't too strong. So Xu-Ifit, very interesting card. We've never really seen anything like it before. You obviously get a big discount on reanimating on a creature because the creatures you reanimate don't have abilities, but is it going to be worth reanimating a creature if it's just a vanilla creature? It's going to be interesting to find out. I feel like this is a cool brew around, although as far as just being like a top tier competitive card, I'd be a little bit surprised. We also got a sweet red mythic in Devastating Onslaught. So Devastating Onslaught, double X in red. For a sorcery, this says create X tokens that are a copy of target artifact or creature you control. Those tokens gain haste until end of turn, sack them at the beginning of the next end step. So Devastating Onslaught, It's kind of like Red Doppelgang. It's way worse than Doppelgang because you're only getting X copies. You're not getting X copies of each thing. So Devastating Onslaught is like pay 3 mana, copy something. Pay 5 mana, get 2 copies of it. 7 mana, 3 copies, so on and so forth, which is still actually pretty powerful when you consider that the cheapest version of this effect is Molten Duplication, which is only 2 mana. You're not paying a huge tax for all the flexibility you get out of casting this with X for a whole bunch of copies of it. And I think that that's really the power of this card. Why it might not be Doppelgang, if you can dump a Doppelgang amount of mana into this, like if you cast Devastating Onslaught for 11 mana, so it's X equal 5, it should still just win you the game if it resolves. Getting 5 copies of something should be enough to make your opponent die on the spot, so it seems really fun to play with. Like I mentioned before, the going rate for this effect is really like 2 mana, I guess, in Molten Duplication and Twin Flame, but those are the only versions of this effect that are 2 mana. The rest of them are 3 mana, like Electro Duplicate and Heat Shimmer, so really, you're not paying much of a tax at all for this being an X spell, which I think means, at least in Commander, this card is kind of going to be an all-star. As far as standard, what do we do with this card? The spiciest shenanigan is to warp Exalted Sunborn and then copy it a ton of times, and you're going to get a ridiculous amount of tokens because of Exalted Sunborn's ability to make even more tokens. Also just like wins the game if you copy something like Terror of the Peaks and get a whole bunch of its enters triggers from all the copies entering. Another place that seems sweet is we played this Outcaster Trailblazer Roaming Throne deck a little while ago that was actually playing Molten Duplication, so you could copy the Outcaster Trailblazer a bunch of times to get a bunch of triggers with the Roaming Throne and make more mana and draw more cards. So I think Devastating Onslaught would be in the conversation there as well. Might not be better than Molten Duplication just because it's 1 more mana to copy Outcaster Trailblazer once, but once you get going, the ability to copy Trailblazer 2 times or 3 times with 1 card is going to generate a huge amount of value and probably win you the game. And in some sense, the ability kind of becomes free with some setups, right? Because the Outcaster Trailblazers make mana when they enter, and especially if a Roaming Throne on human to double trigger the Trailblazers. For every 2 mana that you dump into Devastating Onslaught, you're getting back 2 mana in Outcaster Trailblazers, plus drawing a ton of cards. So there's some interesting combo potential there. The other thing to look for with this card is really 2 things. So I would say in standard, and I'm not saying this is a competitive standard card, but what I'll be looking for when we build around it is I think the sweet spot with this card is a little different than Doppelgang. With Doppelgang, you really need to get up to 11 mana to make it be good. With Devastating Onslaught, I think the sweet spots are probably 5 and 7 mana, because red isn't going to be as good at ramping as a Doppelgang is most likely, but this means that 4 drops and 6 drops are going to be especially powerful with this. You play a 4 drop, the next turn you can double copy it with Devastating Onslaught. You pay a 6 drop, you can triple copy it with Devastating Onslaught the next turn. So stuff like Magmatic Hellkite, you copy this a couple times, blow up some of your opponent's lands, slow him down with the stun counters, hit him in the air. Sun Spinelink, you copy this a couple of times, it might just burn your opponent out of the game depending on their mana base. Some of the best cards to copy with this though are going to be things that have enters and attack triggers. So like play an Overlord of the Boiler Biggles for 6, next turn up all your mana into Devastating Onslaught, copy it 3 times. You kind of just win the game, because each one enters, you get 4 damage from each, and then each one attacks, you get 4 more damage from each. That's like 24 damage, not even counting the Overlord of the Boiler Biggles dealing combat damage themselves. Although one thing I want to point out about this card is it is very risky. So because you're only copying a single thing, if you dump all your mana into like copying Overlord a bunch of times and your opponent just kills the Overlord in response, you kind of just skipped your entire turn. Like the spell fizzles so you don't get your Overlords, Devastating Onslaught does nothing, and you put all of your mana into it. And that's going to be an issue. I don't think you just play this card fairly because it's so risky that you're going to get blown out by a removal spell or a bounce spell or something. But in combo decks where this can just close out the game if it resolves, I could still see it being worth it. As far as Commander is concerned, this card can do some ridiculous things in a lot of different decks. So some commanders just really like being copied, like Atali Primal Conqueror. There's actually a CDH deck around Atali where the whole idea is you play Atali, you spin into things that can copy Atali more to get more Atali triggers, to copy Atali again and do it again. Devastating Onslaught, on one hand, kind of awkward with Atali since as an X spell, if you hit it with Atali, you don't get to copy Atali, but it's also a spell that you can dump 5 mana, 7 mana into and just fairly copy Italia a bunch of times and get a huge amount of triggers. Also, Deadpool trading card will want this for sure, because it's all about just copying Deadpool a bunch of times to give its text box to as much stuff as possible. It's an absurd Zada card. Zada, whenever you target it with an instant or sorcery, you copy it for each other creature you control. So if you can Devastating Onslaught targeting Zada like X2 or X3, it's going to let you copy it X2 or X3 for all your other creatures, and you'll just make the biggest board of creatures imaginable. Also, Roxanne, commanders, they have EDB triggers, so you copy Roxanne a bunch. Sure, there's a legend rule, so they're all going to end up killing themselves, but you're going to get a bunch of meteorites, so you're going to deal a ton of damage, make a ton of mana. So those are the kind of decks I think will really want Devastating Onslaught. The other place it's Q is in decks that can keep the tokens around. So when played normally, you're only getting token copies for one turn. They do have haste, which is nice, but they're going to go away on your end step. But there's a few commanders that get around this. The Master Multiplied just explicitly says your tokens don't get sacrificed on your end set. With Obeka Brute Chronologist, you can go to the end step, put all the exile triggers on the stack, and then end the turn to fizzle all the triggers and keep your stuff forever. Even Zergo Thunder's Decree, it only works with warriors, but your warrior tokens don't get sacrificed on your end step. So these decks are really going to like Devastating Onslaught as well, because it turns that into more of an actual doppelgang, where you're getting these permanent copies of things rather than just temporary copies of things. So Devastating Onslaught, I'd be surprised if this was like a top tier competitive card in Standard, although it could have some cool combo potential. I'm really excited to play with it because I love doppelgangs, I love copying effects, and I love cards that can just do huge splashy things, and Devastating Onslaught is definitely one of those cards. The card for sure is going to be a commander staple in any deck that's looking to play these copy effects. I think this might be the new best version of that effect. Worst case, it's one of the best versions, and it's going to show up in a lot of decks. Next up, we get a pretty cheap removal spell for artifact decks in Hardlight Containment. So 1 mana Aura. You enchant an artifact you control. When it enters, you exile a creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, and the enchanted permanent has Ward of 1. So Hardlight Containment kind of compares to Chained to the Rocks, On Thin Ice, these 1 mana aura-based removal spells, and each of these cards has seen play in the past. There was a time that On Thin Ice was kind of a modern staple when it first came out. Chained to the Rocks saw pretty heavy Pioneer play, still see some Pioneer play in like the Enigmatic Incarnation style decks. So 1 mana Aura that exiles a creature has a pretty good track record for being playable, and I think the same is probably true of this card. The fact that it's only 1 mana definitely makes this kind of appealing for like the artifact decks in Standard. Maybe you're playing Simulacrum Synthesizer. Yeah, I know you got Perilous Snare, which is nice because it actually triggers Simulacrum Synthesizer, but still, just being a single mana, I think makes this at worst a sideboard option for artifact decks, and potentially a main deck option for artifact decks. It's also very good with artifact tokens. One of the problems with playing in like Synthesizer is if you put Hardlight Containment on the Synthesizer, that just doubles your opponent's incentive to blow up the best card that you have on the battlefield, because then they really got to kill the Synthesizer. Yeah, I know you get Ward 1, but that's not really enough of a ward to protect the thing. It's more of just an annoyance. But if you put it on maybe a map token or a clue token or a food token or a treasure token, your opponent really doesn't want to spend the removal to blow up a random, trinket artifact token. So there's higher odds that it actually sticks around. So that's another place for this card. If your deck is really good at making these trinkety artifact tokens, I think this could be an option there as well. Maybe its best home is going to be with Bright Glass Gearhulk. So there is a question with Bright Glass Gearhulk whether this is better than Duskgrove's Reliquary, which is 1 mana, sack an artifact or a creature, exile a artifact or creature an opponent controls so it leaves the battlefield, and it has Ward 2. But we've seen some like Bright Glass Phoenix to tutor up Phoenix down, so when your Bright Glass dies, you can just reanimate it and tutor up more stuff and just kind of keep looping it for value decks. Emerge in Standard, and I think the Hardlight Containment probably could serve a purpose there as well. We'll have to see how it shakes out. Compared to Duskgrove's Reliquary, it is nice that you don't have to sack anything, although in some cases, sacking Bright Glass Gearhulk is an upside, because then you can reanimate it and get its trigger again. But I think it could be in the conversation there. The biggest problem I see for this card, and this might be a deal breaker depending on the meta, is it does pick up on a lot of hate because it isn't an enchantment. and then it has to enchant an artifact. That means pretty much every sideboard hate card, artifact destruction like a Braid, enchantment destruction like Get Lost, is going to be able to blow this up. So regardless of what your opponent's sideboard looks like, they're probably going to have a way to answer this. So maybe it just won't be resilient enough because it has two types which are relatively easy to blow up after sideboarding. The other possibility for this card, and this is more of a stretch, but could this show up maybe in Pioneer or Modern? And the answer, I think, is maybe. So these cards are not staple level effects. It's probably got a better chance in Pioneer than it does in Modern. If you look at the artifacts in decks in Pioneer, they're mostly playing stuff like Portable Holus or Cheap Removal Spell. If you're playing like Pioneer Hammer Time, could Hardlight Containment actually be better? You can just put this on like a random equipment. You don't have the mana value restriction they have for Portable Hole. Yeah, it only gets creatures, but maybe that could possibly be a home for it. We also have a lot of artifact decks back in Modern that are just spewing Mox Opals and Mox Ambers and so forth, turning out affinity threats like Thought Monitor. In these decks, it's a little awkward that it's not an artifact, so it's not upping your affinity counter or whatever, but still, you can easily be casting this on a random Mox as early as turn 1. So I don't think it's a Modern staple, but I could imagine, since it's only 1 mana, there definitely being like a home for this card in a specific deck in Modern. Once you get back to Commander, I think this card actively sucks. I would not play this card in any Commander deck just because I put very little value in this effect. I've come back around on Swords. Like, in Commander, you can just literally use Swords to Plowshares and exile anything at instant speed for 1 mana. You don't have any risk of it sitting on the battlefield. The one kind of home for this card would be some sort of Enchantress deck, right? Where you're just like, I want as many cheap enchantments as possible to trigger my Sethis, but it doesn't really work in Enchantress because it has to go on an artifact. And in an artifact deck, I think I'd rather just play a Swords to Plowshares rather than a removal spell that's going to sit out on the battlefield and eventually get blown up and give my opponent their thing back. So Hardlight Containment seems like a card that could be good in Standard for sure in some sort of artifact deck. Maybe a chance to show up in Pioneer, even less of a chance, but possibly in the right deck in Modern. In Commander, I just don't care about targeted removal enough, anywhere near enough to play this card. We also got a spicy new Warp enchantment in Loading Zone. So Loading Zone, 3 mana green enchantment. It says when 1 or more counters are put on a creature, spacecraft, or planet you control, twice that many of each of those kinds of counters are put on it instead. And then the most important part of this card, you can warp it for 1 mana. So Loading Zone, this is essentially a branching evolution that works with any type of counters for creatures. It's kind of like a doubling season that only works with creatures, spacecrafts, and planets. It's kind of like a leveled up Innkeeper talent. So we got a bunch of versions of this effect, with many of these effects actually in Standard right now. And I think that Loading Zone, if you're just playing it for 4 mana, is going to be worse than these effects in most decks. Like, if you just want its effect, why not pay 1 more mana and just have a literal doubling season that does what it does, but so much more. The upside of this card, though, is warping 1 mana is kind of insane. I kind of see it as a combo piece to power up your planets or spacecraft. Imagine you like warp this for 1 mana, then you warp a Bygone Colossus for 3 mana, 9/9. You tap the Colossus, you get 18 counters on whatever spacecraft or planet land that you want. Even just like a Hazaret or a Rock Cruise for Sako getting at 10 counters. Might Form Harmonizer can easily power up an entire spacecraft if you have a land drop or 2. So I feel like those are the kind of things you're looking to do with this deck. If you're just going to play it fairly, you might as well play Doubling Season in most cases, but the 1 mana warp cost kind of turns this into a weird combo piece to station incredibly quickly. The other place I'm interested in this card is in like the Tifa Lockhart one-shot kill style landfall decks. So in those decks, one of the big kills is Mossborn Hydra. Mossborn Hydra, when a land enters, it gets a +1/+1 counter, then it doubles the counters. We see these decks also playing Zaz Canroy. It's got the 1-drop landfall creature that gets counters. So in a deck like this, the 4 mana mode is just way too expensive for what you want to do. But imagine you warp a Loading Zone and then play a Mossborn Hydra and then like a Fabled Passage. So you play the Fabled Passage, Mossborn Hydra triggers to double the counters on it, but you're actually going to double the doubling, right? So you go from 2 up to 4, and then you crack Fabled Passage, you go 4 up to 8, but 8 goes up to 16. So by itself, you get a 16 power Mossborn Hydra, but if you add like a Traveling Chocobo to the mix, which is also in those decks, to double up your landfall triggers, then this just becomes a one-shot kill all by itself. maybe on like turn 4, which actually seems really powerful. Plus it synergizes with the rest of the stuff in the deck. So this is a case where, because the Tifa Lockhart landfall deck is so efficient, you don't want the 4-mana enchantment, but the 1-mana mode actually seems really good. The other possibility is just to use it with something like Goldvein Hydra, where it's tough to play a loading zone for 4 mana. Next turn you're going to untap, play a big Goldvein, but with the 1-mana warp cost, you can warp this in and just dump all the rest of your mana into the Goldvein Hydra. You're going to get twice as many counters, hit your opponent for a massive amount of damage. So that warp cost really makes this card way more interesting. You could even see an argument for it in some of the older formats. It's like a combo piece where maybe you're playing Hardened Scales and you got Walking Bliss to Arcbound Ravager. Having double counters for a single turn is really all you need, because it's probably going to win you the game, because you sack all your stuff to Ravager for twice as many counters, dump all the counters on Walking Ballista, which is also doubled, ping your opponent out of the game. So I think this card actually has potential to be kind of busted, just because the 1-mana warp cost is absolutely ridiculous. As far as Commander is concerned, I think in just a generic +1/+1 counter deck, it's probably worse than like Branching Evolution or Doubling Season, but there's a few specific homes where I really like this card. Plus, in the generic +1/+1 counter deck, you can always just play as an additional version of Doubling Season or whatever, but really good with Spacecraft, obviously, since it specifically works with them. One of the best ways to quickly power up Hearthal or Infinite Guideline Station. It's also very cute with Expel Hydra style decks like Zixara, Mega Luciacane. In those decks, you can do the same Goldvein Hydra trick, where you warp this, yeah, it only sticks around for 1 turn, but you can dump all your mana into a big X Hydra to make a massive creature. Also, like I said, it's not super exciting with just generic +1/+1 counters like Bristly Bill or the Wise Wasp Man, just because you get a bunch of options for the deck, but you can probably still just play it as like a slightly more expensive version of Branching Evolution. The other place this card is really cool is in decks that have weird counters. Like if you're playing Arwen Mortal Queen or Thelen of the Havenwood, which cares about spore counters, Branching Evolution only works with +1/+1 counters, but Loading Zone can double the indestructible counters on Arwen. It can double the spore counters on all your funguses. Yeah, Doubling Season can also do the same thing, but this is a cheaper Doubling Season and you get the warp cost. So if you care about something other than just +1/+1 counters, then this card gets even better. So Loading Zone, I'm kind of blown away that you can warp this for 1 mana. I think that 1 mana warp cost turns this into a pretty legit combo piece, all the way from Standard, potentially back through Modern or even older formats, and it makes it very exciting in Commander. We also got a new black rare spacecraft, an Entropic Battlecruiser. So a 4-mana spacecraft. It has station, of course. If you get 1 or more counters on it, whenever an opponent discards a card, they lose 3 life. And then if you get 8 or more counters on it, it becomes a 3/10 flying Death Toucher. Then when it attacks, each opponent discards a card, each opponent who can't loses 3 life, and of course if they discard a card, then they have to lose 3 life. So Entropic Battlecruiser, the card's really cool. It seems like a super fun build around for a discard deck, although I am a little worried it's just kind of expensive compared to the other versions of this effect. Like, the cheapest version of this effect, Liliana's Caress, is 2-mana enchantment. When opponent discards a card, they lose 2 life. The original Megrim 3-mana enchantment does the same thing. So paying 4 mana for this effect makes me worried that it's too slow. If you think about a discard deck, you often want to be casting your discard spells on turn 1, on turn 2, on turn 3 to get your opponent out of cards early in the game, not waiting until after turn 4 when your opponent might already be light on cards if they're aggro. So I worry that costing 4 mana is just kind of going to make this an against the odds card in Standard rather than a truly competitive build around in Standard. Its last mode kind of reminds me a little bit of Crocs or whatever. Like, if you actually do get this turned on, which I don't know how you realistically do that in a discard deck, which typically is pretty creature light anyway. So I think in the discard deck, you're hoping to like have a Bugler Rats or a Tiny Bones that can get you to that first level, but getting to 8+ counters seems like kind of an unrealistic goal. But still, if you get there, it kind of turns into a Karoxa, where it is a powerful attack trigger, and a 3/10 flying Death Touch is quite a big butt on a body. In Standard, we do have pieces for a discard deck, and we've even seen these decks already show up in Standard to some extent with Bandit's Talent and Rankle's Break. You got Tiny Bone Boggle Burglar, so you got a lot of pieces for a discard deck, even with Hopeless Nightmare Band. But like I said before, my concern is just, at 4 mana, I'm afraid I have already mostly emptied my opponent's hand by the time this comes down. And if your opponent doesn't have cards to discard, this kind of doesn't do anything, especially if you can't tap 8 power creatures to turn it on. So I'm still planning on building around it, because I love Megrim style discard decks, but I am a little concerned that, man, if it was 1 less mana, I think this card would be way, way stronger. In Standard, one of the downsides of this card is a lot of wheel effects effects now. Wizards has worded so it's kind of a may, so your opponent doesn't have to discard their hand and draw new cards, because those are some of the easiest ways to power up a Megrim style effect, right? If everyone has to discard their hand, draw 7, you can get a ton of triggers off something like this. But we do have Dragon Mage in Standard thanks to Foundation. When it deals combat damage, each player discards their hand, draws 7 cards. There's no may there. Your opponent can't choose not to do it. So we probably could build some sort of funny Entropic Battlecruiser Dragon Mage wheel deck in Standard. It's also kind of a weird hate card for like Monument to Endurance if your opponent's deck is all about discarding cards, which we actually see quite a bit between Monument to Endurance, some of the Prophsidenic Memory, Reanimated Oculus style deck, that you can just play this even without discard and be like, as you're doing your thing, I'm just going to drain you out of the game. We'll have to see, again, if at 4 mana it's efficient enough for that plan, but it is funny. Once you get back to older formats, you have a bunch of Dark Deals and Wheel of Fortunes and Memory Jars, where you get this down, just wheel into wheel into wheel, and burn your opponent out of the game like you do with Liliana's Caress. I think you would play this in discard decks in Commander, like Tiny Bones or Turgid, everyone's favorite decks to play against in Commander, but it also just seems good in wheel decks, like Nekuzar or Shieldred. If you're going to be wheeling constantly, this is going to offer a ton of damage, and in Commander, I'm not super intimidated to tap 8 power worth of creatures. That seems pretty easy, even in a wheel style deck, if you do want to turn it into a creature. So Entropic Battlecruiser, I really like this card. For Standard purposes, I wish it was like 1 mana cheaper, and then I'd be really hyped about it in discard decks. As it is, I'm still very excited to build around it in discard decks. We'll see if it's actually cheap enough to really be good in those decks, or if it's just a little bit too slow. Worst case, fun card for discard and wheel-based Commander decks. We also got maybe the best robot we've seen from the entire set in Pinnacle Emissary. So a 3-mana 3/3 artifact creature robot. It's an Is It card. It says when you cast an artifact, create a 1/1 colorless drone artifact creature token with flying, and this token can only block creatures with flying, and you can warp it for a hybrid Is It mana. So Pinnacle Emissary, it's kind of like Psymaster Thopterus with a better body, kind of like a Saheeli Sublime Artificer, kind of like an efficient construction. Yeah, it's a little annoying that your drone tokens can't block, even though just making 1/1 flyers is pretty powerful anyway. So it's like a Psy that's worse on defense, but has that warp cost that lets you get it down cheaper and has a better body. So in Standard, it's kind of cute that it double triggers Simulacrum Synthesizer. This is 1 mana warp it for a 3 mana spell, which will trigger Synthesizer, and then on a later turn, you can just do it again to trigger Synthesizer. We'll have to see. Right now, artifact decks are kind of blue-white, so they want to go into red for this effect. They actually might, because in an artifact deck, this can make a ton of 1/1 tokens, which, even though they can only block flyers, still seems pretty powerful. There's also a bunch of other artifact payoffs in Standard that haven't really caught on to the level of Synthesizer, but we have like Legion Extruder, Nexus of Becoming. We got reanimation effects like Duretti Rocketeer Engine. We got Edgar, which can draw a huge amount of cards. So we'll have to see, outside of this Synthesizer decks, exactly what home it ends up in, but I think this card is very, very playable. I could even see an argument for playing this in Modern. In Modern, we had a bunch of decks thanks to the Mox Opal unbanning, which are really good at just spewing 0 mana artifacts. Mox Opal, Mox Amber, Mishra's Bauble, and this is where you can really see the power of that 1 mana warp mode on Pinnacle Emissary. There could easily be a Modern deck where on turn 1, you play a land, you warp this, and then you just go like, Mox, Bauble, Mox, or whatever, and you end up with like 4 1/1 flyers on turn 1. That actually seems pretty realistic. I've seen enough decks like cast an Emery on turn 1 against me in Modern that I have to think that in the right shell, this could really pop off in Modern. Plus, you get some additional synergies, right? This is an artifact that makes artifacts, which makes it a pretty good way to like power up affinity threats like Kappa Cannoneer, Thought Monitor, just flooding the board with these cheap dorky drone tokens. So I think this could actually be a Modern playable card in those Mox decks or in an affinity style shell. Heck, you could even see it show up in Vintage. Maybe Vintage is a format that's built around free artifacts and Moxen and Black Lotus. So I can imagine you warping this and just casting all your Moxen, making a bunch of 1/1s. I don't know, I'm not a Vintage expert, but that 1 mana warp cost is very, very scary. In Commander, I think this card is good in basically any artifact deck that wants creatures. Like Brea wants a bunch of artifacts that you can sacrifice. Joyra likes to cast a bunch of historic spells, including artifacts. Saheeli wants you to cast a bunch of artifacts. In any sort of artifact deck, this card seems good enough as an artifact that you can cast twice to trigger all of your stuff like Joyra or whatever, your Saheeli. Plus, it just floods the board with other artifacts. But the easiest best home for this card, and the one place that I know I'm going to play it, Burdiclad Telcor Engineer. Burdiclad this Artificer. It's an is it 4/4. It says creature tokens you control at face. And the beginning of combat on your turn, you create a 2/1 mirror artifact creature token. Then you can choose a token you control, and all your other tokens become copies of that tokens. In Verticlad, this seems like the absolute perfect card. You make all these random drones that aren't that great, and then you use Verticlad to turn all those random drones into whatever your most powerful token is, and probably just win the game. So it is like the ultimate Verticlad card. So Pinnacle Emissary, I think this card is sneakily one of the most powerful cards in the entire set. I think the 1 mana warp cost gives it potential in older constructed formats. In Standard, good with Synthesizer, maybe in some other homes. And in Commander, you can play this in pretty much any artifact deck and get value out of it. As far as lower rarity cards, we got a few that I really like today, starting with Dauntless Scrapbot, which is honestly one of the cards I've been waiting for from this set for Commander. So it's a 3 mana 3/1 robot. It's a colorless card, most importantly. When it enters, exile each opponent's graveyard, and then you create a lander token. So the Rampant Growth token you can sack for 2 to ramp out a basic land. So why am I excited for this card? Well, this is kind of a weird combo of Bogart Trawler that hits all of your opponent's graveyards, which is actually a pretty powerful incidental effect in Commander, mixed with like a Burnished Heart effect. The big reason I'm excited for this is if you're a color that's not good at ramping, like you're mono red or mono black or mono blue, I think this card is going to make the cut in a lot of my decks as a ramp spell, just because I put a lot of value in ramping lands on the battlefield over than playing mana rocks. So I feel like this is probably going to be good enough in a lot of my monocolor decks. Plus, I really like that you just accidentally get to blow people out if they're playing a graveyard deck. And it gets even better if you just care about artifacts. Like in Urza Lord High Artificer, this is a 3-mana artifact that adds 2 artifacts to the battlefield that then you can tap to Urza's ability, or it's 2 artifacts you can sack to Breya or do Osgir shenanigans with. So I think the card could be good there as well. And like I said before, if you have a friend that's playing Marin or Midroltha, Corridor or something, this is your ramp spell that actually just blows the graveyard player out of the game too. So Dauntless Scrapbot, I know it's not like super push. Technically, it's 5 total mana to ramp, 3 to cast, 2 more to actually get the land with the lander token. But I still think in colors that struggle with land ramp, this is going to make the cut in a lot of my decks. We also got an interesting new bite spell in Close Encounter. So Close Encounter, 2 mana instant. Instant speed, kind of huge on this card, is an additional cost to cast the spell. Choose a creature you control or a warped creature you control in exile, and then it deals damage equal to the creature's power to target creature. So Close Encounter, I really like this effect. So on one hand, it works with cards that are warped, which seems really powerful. A lot of the fight effects, like a Bushwhack or even a bite effect like Hard Hitting Question, the way they're formatted, if your opponent kills the creature or bounces the creature, whatever, that you target in response, it fizzles the entire effect, right? You go to Bushwhack and fight and your opponent kills your creature, you don't have anything to fight with, so it doesn't work. Same with Hard Hitting Question. The way Close Encounter is formatted, yes, it's 1 more mana, so it's 2 mana, but it works in a way that it's going to be almost impossible, actually literally impossible, to get blown out by this, because you can just target something in exile, and even if you target something that's on the battlefield, it's an additional cost of the spell rather than an effect that happens after the spell resolves. So I think this is a really good version of the bite effect. It seems really good in warp style decks, and I could also see this actually just beating out Hard Hitting Questions in like mono green style decks, where being an instant is a huge upgrade, even if it costs 1 more mana. So Close Encounter, I think this actually might be a playable bite spell. Definitely worth keeping in mind if you're warping or playing big green creatures. We also got a new blue bounce spell in Desculpting Blast. So a 2 mana instant. It says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If it's attacking, you create a 1/1 colorless drone artifact creature token with flying that can only block creatures with flying. So Desculpting Blast, I think this card is close to being playable. Also, I do not know what to make of that art. I don't know if I love this art or hate this art or even what's going on in this art, but definitely a unique piece of art. Desculpting Blast, the problem I see with the card is it's probably just worse into the Flood Maw, although it does have the upside that you can bounce your own things, which occasionally comes up with Into the Flood Maw, and I'm like, I really would like to bounce my own creature to like fizzle a removal spell and save it, but that doesn't actually work with Into the Flood Maw. So it's nice you can hit your own stuff, but we also have like Into the Royal, Unauthorized Exit, that are 2 mana bounce spells that don't really see play. Is the 1/1 drone artifact creature token enough of an upside to make this playable? We'll have to wait and see. So I don't think that Desculpting Blast is like a staple level effect, but I also think it is close enough to being playable that you gotta at least keep it in mind and remember that it is in the format. Rounding things out today, we also got the rest of the cards on the land bonus sheet, and I gotta give a shout out to Wizards. These cards look so incredibly good. Whether the actual card is playable or not, these have some of my favorite art that I have seen in Magic in a very, very long time. Plus, some of the cards are actually pretty good. The big one today, Ancient Tomb getting reprinted, which is like a $100 staple in Legacy, a game changer in Commander. And this is probably going to be the chase card, or at least one of the most chase cards from the entire set. This is what you're going to be hoping to open. If you crack open a box of Edge of Eternities, I expect it's going to be pretty expensive, and the art on it is just absolutely spectacular. We also got all 10 of the creature lands, which would be much more exciting like 10 years ago. These cards really reminded me of like 2015 Magic. They don't see nearly as much play now anymore, but back like 10 years ago, the era of Raging Ravine, Jund in Modern, Stirring Wildwood saw a ton of Modern play. These cards used to be super, super good. It just turns out that Magic's kind of gotten faster. It's been power crept a little bit, so you don't see these tap creature dual lands see that much play anymore, but at least they have super cool art. I just don't know where I'd use them. Like if I open one of these, I don't know what deck I'd put them in, since they don't really see playing Modern, they don't really see playing Commander, so I don't know what home I'd have for them, but they do look super cool. The single card I'm most excited about though is Strip Mine. So Strip Mine is on the land sheet. It, like all of them, has really amazing art, but the exciting part about this is the first time that Strip Mine is coming to Magic Arena, and there are already people freaking out about this card, wanting it banned in Timeless or restricted in Timeless, and I gotta say, I am very hyped to finally get to teach some Arena Zoomers about Strip Mine. It's kind of funny to see people freak out about a card like this. I could get it if you're putting it in Standard or something. I would love having Strip Mine in Standard, but I get that like 90% of Magic players, probably more than that, would not enjoy Standard with Strip Mine. But Timeless is such a busted format where there's dark rituals and show and tells, and just like, it is a really busted format. It's hard for me to think that Strip Mine is going to be across the line. Worst case, even if it is, leave it legal for a few weeks so I can teach some Arena Zoomers about it, and then you can ban it after that. That's fine if it gets to that point. But I'm super hyped to have Strip Mine coming to Magic Arena. We already got Blood Moon. We're going to be able to build such a sweet prison deck in Timeless now. Speaking of sweet new cards coming to Magic Arena, we also got all 10 of the special guests from the set, and I feel like a broken record, but the art on these is so cool. They look like old, like 50s sci-fi book covers, and they just look so cool. The art is so spectacular to the point where I almost wish they made the whole set like this, but that would probably be bad because then no one could read the cards and no one would know what to do. But these are some pretty solid reprints. So all 10 of these you can find in play boosters or in collector boosters, and the big deal about them is why they don't change legality based on this reprint. They're not going to be Standard legal or Modern legal if they weren't already legal in those formats before. It does change legality on Magic Arena. So this will be the first time Silver Overlord, like a $50, $60 reprint, comes to Magic Arena for Brawl. We got Green Sun Zenith, also like $30 thanks to its unbanning in Modern, coming to Arena for the first time. Could be relevant back in like Timeless. Burgeoning, really solid Ram spell, also like $40. Darkness, the Black Fog, one of the only good Black Fogs, maybe the only good Black Fog, but still Darkness is one of my favorite cards to get people with in Commander. I always played in my black decks. Megas of the Moon joining Blood Moon, so now we can play 8 Blood Moon effects in the format. And I think Paradox Haze, funny, janky, like against the odds build around getting extra upkeeps, but still first time to Arena. The rest of the cards, Deafening Silence, Nexus of Fate, whatever, they look super cool, but they're basically just fancy, pretty reprints that you can take advantage of. But I gotta say the selections this time, really solid. Like, value's really good, and the art just looks spectacular, plus we get some sweet new things for Arena. Finally, we get some jank, some limited draft chaff that you can check out over on MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Edge of Eternity spoilers for today. So, pretty big day here at week number 2. What do you think? What do you think of the new cards? What do you think of the land sheet? Should Strip Mine actually get restricted in Timeless? Is it that busted? What do you think of the special guests? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you all enjoy it. And I'll be back tomorrow with even more Edge of Eternity spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more Magic? Well, check out our VV Hollow One video that we played in Modern a couple days ago, and you can also find yesterday's spoiler video right here.